Hello, folks. Welcome to the first episode of the Ninjutsu podcast, something that I'm putting together to kind of give back to the community of the Bujinkan and Ninjutsu. So, the, there will be mistakes made. I'm making this up on the fly. Hopefully, it will get better as it goes along. But really, those of you that think that you do perfect the first time you try something, well, ask your wives. I will be putting together things I think will be of interest to people that practice what's called ninjutsu in the Bujinkan, relating to self-defense, history, philosophy, and things like that. I'd like to start this off with a discussion about the Kusarigama and the possibilities that it was invented by the ninja related to the Kyoketsu Soga. So, first of all, I want to get something about the Kusarigama out. Okay, let's make this clear. The Kusarigama is not an agricultural weapon improvised into a weapon. Uh, the the kama again is a skith, and for agriculture you need something lightweight to be able to use it all day. For combat you need something that's sturdier and heavier. So the kama that you use with the Kusarigama is not the one that they use to pull rice out of the field. That's the first thing that I want to get out there. So it's not that somebody just picked up a kama and improvised it, and it's not that you can do that. Instead, the kama is a specially made weapon that's attached to a chain, which is kusari in Japanese. And the second thing I want to talk about, get out there about the kusarigama is that is not a battlefield weapon. Okay, not that it can't be used in combat, but for combat, for battlefields, you need to be able to work with other people. Yes, you can send out 200 people with their own individual weapons, fighting individually, not in coordination with anyone else. But you give me 50 people that have trained together and work as a team, and I will defeat all 200 with those 50 people, no problem. The Kusarigama, of course, you spin the chain. This makes it very difficult to stand side to side with other people like you can with a spear or almost any other weapon. So the Kusarigama and, of course, the Kyoketsu Shoge is an individual weapon. It's used for things like duels. Kyoketsu Shoge, of course, was used by the ninja. If they were alone and they were confronted by guards, well, yeah, then they could swing that rope with the weight at the end, and the range of the rope is the range of the weapon. So they could conceal it inside something, it could be concealable, but it can also reach out to somebody. Same thing with the Kusarigama. You've got a weapon that, yes, it's concealable to a certain extent, and it can reach out to people. So if you got someone with a spear, you can reach them. Not great, but it works. So yeah, so the Kusarigama is not a battlefield weapon; it's an individual weapon, which makes it kind of interesting that I'm going to go through this. Something that happened. I was in Japan, and Soke Hatsumi came out with a series of articles for Hiden magazine, and there was a picture on it. And one of the pictures was basically of him. The lead picture of all the articles was basically of him carrying it had a chain, it had a weight at the end with studs to improve the thumpage, and at the end it had something that looked like a kama but with a spike on it. So it was like a big Kyoketsu Shoge in many ways, and I never seen it before. I went to my teacher, who coincidentally was also a master of the Kyoketsu Shoge, and asked what was going on, and he said, "Well, that's the combat version of the Kyoketsu Shoge." Okay, so maybe I better back up a bit. Now, there's this myth that the ninja had all these exotic looking weapons, and this is and anything that looked cool, stuff like that. In reality, Japan at the before the modern age basically was a bunch of fiefs, and to get from one area to another, you basically had to like go through customs. Usually, these were the choke points. Like rivers are a great place to between provinces, and they would set up places at like bridges or ferries or stuff like that. And at that point, you were probably going to be searched. Especially if you look about the age and build of a typical warrior. So really, instead of like all these great weapons that are specially made and stuff like that, really the weapons and tools of ninja fall into three categories, roughly. I go into this more in my books, but one is dual purpose. Okay, so yeah, like the kunai. The kunai was a tool to and it could also be used for a lot of other things. So you could carry a kunai openly through customs, so to speak. The second type is one that could be easily concealed, sword canes, things like that. These would have a better than average chance of getting through a cursory examination. So, it's still a bit of a risk. The last one is category is things that can be constructed once they reach the target area. These are things, in the Bansen Shukai, which, if you look at my translation, you can see that they tell how to construct these things. It's, it's, it's interesting to note that, these were not things that, part of their team made for them in Iga and then they carried there. The instructions are how to make them. So once they got there, they could put these things together. Now, the Kyoketsu Shoge basically is mainly the third category, with the knife being in the first one. We're used to the ring being used, in demonstrations, stuff like that. That just makes it easier to catch for demonstrations, and you always catch the end of the Kyoketsu Shoge in a demonstration. I've done it many times. I've got a reputation among the Japanese shihan as being the guy that dies very excellently when facing a Kyoketsu Shoge in the hands of my teacher. So yeah, but really could be anything. And one of the things that it can be, and seems to have been, is a hook, a metal hook, which might surprise you. Well, the other part of the thing that makes up a Kyoketsu Shoge is a rope. And a rope is very valuable. I mean, it's, you can carry it around, and without suspicion. It's very useful. Just ask Sam from the Fellowship of the Rings. But one thing that most people, I mean, a lot of people just try to get straight into ninja history, like don't even learn the language or don't even learn any other part of things, instead of reading and doing everything that they can to enrich themselves. And one thing that you don't understand is that you can tie ropes down. If you've got a pack or something like that and you want to tie it all together with a rope, you can tie it together. But if you've ever had a knot that is just so bad that you could not open it, had to cut through it, well, that's a waste. Another thing is that if you've ever tried to untie a knot when your fingers are frozen, yeah, it's damn near impossible. But if you do like a catty corner type thing, with those squares, and then you use the hook to hook it off at the end, well then, it's secure. But to get it loose, all you gotta do is unhook it. So yeah, so there we got two parts of the three parts of the Kyoketsu Shoge: the hook, or weight, and the rope. Now that comes to the knife part. And yeah, this is one that I picked up, this is, ready-made. But my teacher that used the Kyoketsu Shoge in demonstrations in Japan, what he used was actually what's called part of it, they're typically called Jumonjiari or Kamaya, like that, a little hooked at the edge of a spear end. And he got it cheap at a flea market because the tang had been broken off and it was only very short. Tangs are typically, for a spear, would be about, about a foot or, a third of a meter long. And, he picked it up cheap, and he kind of made a comment that, yeah, it was actually kind of common back then. For things like this, I mean, this type of spear end with the hook on it, the idea was basically if you were on foot and you were going against someone on horse, well, of course you would try to nail them with the spear, but chances are it would just bounce off, the armor and go past him. Well, on the rebound, you can pull him and have him fall off the horse. And then once he hits the ground hard from falling off the horse, well, Bob's your uncle. You've got all these infantrymen, on him like piranha on a cow that falls into a stream. So these types of spear ends were actually fairly common. First issue of Denjo magazine that I put out, I put up a whole thing on spears in it, and it seems that maybe 10% or more of the spears out there, if not greater, I mean a lot of spears, had a hook of one type or the other. So yeah, so one thing I have to understand that Japan is a metal poor country, and good knives are hard to find. And there was a lot of stripping of the dead off of battlefields and using their stuff. It's not inconceivable that the Kyoketsu Shoge, knife was actually one of these or made to look like one of these because, again, it's likely that knives that were battlefield scraps were fairly common running around, or at least common enough that something that was made to look like it would not attract attention. So you can get the knife with the handle in through openly, the rope openly, the hook openly, and on the other side, you just put it all together. Nice thing about rope, it doesn't clank. Oh, and the hook, I forgot to mention. The ninja uses this thing called a shinobi kumade, which is basically a rope and a hook run through sections of bamboo. When you pressed on it so that it was all together, then you can put the hook on something without clattering around like a grappling hook would, and just hook it there and then use it to pull up. And of course, you could also use the hook and the rope to pull up gear if you were carrying around things like arson tools and stuff like that. So yeah, so you can get through a checkpoint fairly easily with that. And once you're there, again, it's a covert weapon. The chain does not, the rope does not clank. And it's very useful for many things aside from being a weapon. But if you're going into combat, of course, you would want something more sturdy than a rope. Go with a chain. You'd want something a little bit larger than the knife thing. Because no matter what women say, size matters. There's a reason I moved to Japan. And so, if you practice a lot with the Kyoketsu Shoge, then just picking up the chain version, well, the skills flow over. So yeah, there might be a relationship there, right there. I mean, how close is this to the Kusarigama and the way it's used? This seems kind of interesting considering that what happened with Miyamoto Musashi. In 1607, he faced a guy whose name we know as only really as Shishido. There's a couple other, Shishido would be his family name. There's other possibilities that for his given name. We don't really know for certain. But again, it's reported that Shishido fought Musashi with a Kusarigama in 1607 and died. Shishido, incidentally, was from Iga, which is kind of interesting. Now, not everybody from Iga was a ninja. It's complicated. I go into it elsewhere, but let's just say that there was a lot of non-ninja in Iga. But again, sometimes they kind of cross-trained. They taught each other things. A guy that went off to battle and killed a few people with something like, let's say the combat version of the Kyoketsu Shoge or the non-combat version of the Kyoketsu Shoge, might have, got a reputation and people went to learn from him. It's a possibility. And the timing, 1607, this is interesting to me. And let me just go back and kind of explain things. This is kind of going to be boring for people that are really into Japanese history, but it's kind of necessary. There were 3 shogunates in Japanese history. First one started at the end of the 12th century by the Minamoto clan. And by securing it, Minamoto Yoritomo secured from the emperor the idea that anyone from the Minamoto bloodline, the Minamoto clan, could be shogun. So he meant it for his children, Now, here's the thing, is that Japanese historically change their names a lot. It really makes sometimes trying to figure out who's who ridiculous. Depends on, they change their name and it's like, anyways. So the first shogunate was the Minamoto, shogunate. And it was centered out of Kamakura, which is not too far from Tokyo. Have you ever seen that, the large bronze Buddha sitting in the open? That's Kamakura. The second one basically was a case, again, Minamoto clan, but they called themselves Ashikaga. And the Ashikaga ruled after deposing the old shogunate for a while. But in 1467, there was a succession dispute, and for 10 years there was just an absolute chaotic war called the Oni no Ran. Ran, of course, meaning war, but it has connotations of being like, a lot of screaming and yelling, and nobody really knows what's going on. More so than regular wars, so to speak. So this period, 1467, 1477, basically kicked off a period of lawlessness where everyone was going after each other. The back of the shogunate had been broken. And for almost a century or about a century, it was complete war. The Japanese call it the Sengoku Jidai, the age of war. And until some people started unifying, it was, entire generations were born, grew old, and died without there being a single year of peace in Japan. If you've seen any war movies from Japan with the samurai, chances are it's from the Sengoku Jidai. Now, what happened was, and I'm going to have to go through this, kind of important. First, there was a guy named Oda Nobunaga who started unifying, Japan. Um, he ended up getting killed by one of his own men called Akechi Mitsuhide. The last few years that Oda was running things, he was not a battlefield commander. I mean, he was like Eisenhower compared to like someone like Patton. He stayed in the Kyoto area for the most part, just sending out generals like Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu. These were the guys in the battlefield. Anyway, so, again, he was betrayed by Akechi, who surrounded where he was and just would not let anyone out as they tossed in fire, and everybody in the building with Oda Nobunaga died, which led to a succession dispute between Toyotomi and Tokugawa. And they're about ready to go at it for a while. It's like almost open warfare. But Tokugawa, who history has described as being a very cunning individual, very sly and devious, bent the knee. But of course, he kept his armies and all that. And Toyotomi was kind of suspicious because they had almost come to blows. So he made Tokugawa move to a place called Edo up in the north. We'd call this Tokyo now. And he really didn't involve Tokugawa too much in things as he continued to unify Japan. And when he invaded Korea to try to get to China, twice, Tokugawa didn't really participate all that much. Kept his powder dry, so to speak. So all things came to a head in 1600. In the 10th month, the month that had no gods. Toyotomi had died, and he had an infant son. This is when Tokugawa made his move. And at a place called Sekigahara, there was a huge battle, at which the forces that were fighting for the infant Toyotomi, run by Ishida Mitsunari, were defeated. This heralded in the next shogunate. Tokugawa was of the Minamoto clan. He could be a shogun. And in 1603, he made the emperor declare him shogun. Again, we're kind of getting here. Of course, the Toyotomi were still around. And if you read Musashi by Yoshikawa, it's a good book. It's fiction, but it's a good book. Or if you see the movie Samurai 1, 2, and 3 with Toshiro Mifune, it's a good book. But one thing you find out, like in 1614, again, things came to the head. The Toyotomi basically led rebellion against the Tokugawa. There was a brief peace, then 1615, it was all over. Okay? The Toyotomi's bloodline was defeated. It would no longer existed. From that point on, basically there was no real wars, aside from peasants' uprisings, stuff like that. And things changed really quick in Japan. All of a sudden, warriors were not learning to fight in units. They carried around a sword all the time. They learned how to use their sword, but they mainly were learning how to fight individually with a sword without armor. Things changed a lot. Dueling, of course, became the main way you could die from a sword. And a lot of things a lot of things that were taught became more about dueling, about more dealing with one person or maybe a self-defense situation, stuff like that, rather than the battlefield. And this is where we start to see the Kusarigama come into play. The Kusarigama, again, it's not a battlefield weapon, but it is an individual weapon. And one of the advantages of the Kusarigama is that nobody knows how to use it unless they've actually tried to learn how to face it and how to use it. And that's what a lot of duelists tried to take advantage of, is that, they would, as samurai, they would learn how to use a sword, just like everyone else. So when they face someone with a sword, they know what the swordsman could do. But the chances of the swordsman knowing what the Kusarigama could do was very low. In fact, it was kind of the Kusarigama was kind of associated with females because if they had to suddenly duel or do some damage, they would try to take advantage of the Kusarigamas being unfamiliar to a lot of people. There's stories, a few stories I think of like a daughter whose father was killed unjustly, and so she goes on the road of vengeance and learns the Kusarigama in order to challenge her father's killer to a duel. She could not hope to learn the sword and be as good as a swordsman with that learning curve, but the Kusarigama would give her a slight advantage. So that's the idea. The Kusarigama came into popularity during the peacetime of what is called the Edo period, or the Pax Tokugawa sometimes. But you'll notice that if you've been following what I'm saying, that really the Pax Tokugawa, everything was after 1615 when the Toyotomi was defeated. Again, the Yoshikawa novel on Musashi, there's the background that everyone is getting ready for this inevitable showdown between the Toyotomi and the Tokugawa. They know it's coming. They're practicing for it. They're ready for the battlefield, exploits that they will need to do. They're not really able to say that war is behind them, that battles are behind them. So men like Musashi are going around with swords, showing how good they are with the swords, because swords can be used on the battlefield. And they want to position training people to get, to be training the soldiers that will be on the battlefield for this final showdown. And yet, in the middle of this, in 1607, between the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600 and the final showdown in 1615, 1607, Shishido is using a Kusarigama. That's rather unusual. I mean, we don't really know when the Kusarigama was invented. I mean, nobody really noticed it for a while. Shishido's use of it is one of the first examples we are aware of. So there's no smoking gun. But I think the evidence, what we know is highly suggestive that the Kyoketsu Shoge was developed by the ninja with two different versions. Ones that would carry on missions, ones that when they knew trouble was coming. And that helped develop the Kusarigama. Incidentally, Kusarigamas, sometimes they do have spikes on them. And there's numerous different types of kamas for the Kusarigama that you see. I mean, just look on some YouTube videos and see the demonstrations, and you see some of them look very different from each other. Nothing like the agricultural instrument. So, yeah, I can't say that I have any proof, but I strongly believe that the ninja developed the Kyoketsu Shoge, developed two versions, and then because once the Edo period came around, it just started gaining advocates and practitioners from others, samurai and otherwise, that wanted a dueling weapon. So yeah, so maybe this really doesn't help your training or anything like that, but maybe it kind of piques your interest and it's kind of interesting. And well, I hope somebody gets value out of this. I'll be putting out more episodes. They'll get more and more technically better as we go along. I'm kind of winging it, but I do want to give back and I do want to show people things that will be of use to them in their studies. Take care and see you in 2024.